Hello once again, everyone, and welcome back to our Wallerstein series. As you can see, we're filming in a very different location today. We are on the loading dock, and as such there will be a little bit of strangeness, but we got it as square as we possibly could, so this shouldn't be that bad. Now, if you've been following along, then you will have seen how we've gone over the original sketches by Albrecht Dürer. Then we took a brief detour back into the past to go over some plays that had text associated with them from an earlier source, and now we're going to be returning to Herr Dürer to finish off. Now, an important thing to consider is that we don't necessarily know what the context of these sketches is. So, for all we know, he could have been trying to capture specific plays. He may have just been sketching what he saw, and more so than with any of the other sketches he's done, these ones we have no idea. It's not the sort of, blocking positions that we went over the first time, and really having some accompanying text could make this make a lot more sense, but since we don't have anything, we're just going to have to work from where we go. Now, one of the first theories that you may have is, okay, could these positions come out of the positions we went over before? Unfortunately, not so much. Nothing really makes a ton of sense, though we will cover it a tiny bit. Beyond that, though, helping me out today is Jacob, and let's go ahead and start off with our first sketch. So our very first sketch is going to find, the image itself will be our longsword fencer is going to end up right foot forward, basically in Langenor, right? As though he had just finished a cut or been fighting from the bind. Meanwhile, our messer fencer is going to be, it looks like he's cross-stepping, no necessarily guarantee, with his blade on the longsword fencer's arm. Perhaps he is also thrusting into the chest. We can't quite tell as they are in the reverse position from us currently. But how could we end up into this position? Well, this one more so than the others makes a decent amount of sense. So the properties of messer versus longsword, as we've discussed before, is that he is going to have leverage and power. Right? Anytime he does a cut, I really can't ignore it. And while I can meet him in a bind, it's very easy for him to use both of his hands to overpower me without much difficulty. My advantage, meanwhile, is that I have a closer, effective range. I can fight much more comfortably from about here than he can. I also have a tighter center of rotation. So from this distance, for Jacob to do a proper cut, let's go ahead and have I win the bind. For him to do a proper cut coming around at me, go ahead. He has to get that much rotation to get his sword into presence. Now, he can do it a little tighter than that, but he loses out on cutting mechanics. So it's good for him to get sort of the normal rotation. Versus me, if we're in this bind, all I have to do is get my wrist to turn over, which, as you see, my blade doesn't have to leave presence at all to achieve that cut. Which means once I get within my effective range, I can really kind of harry him. However, he has that leverage to keep me at bay. So my thought as to how we might be getting to this position is that we're probably following the advice of what has come before, that being we're going to catch him on the nail. So he comes in with a cut against me, and I'm catching him on the nail with the flat, right? Now from here, it's not particularly difficult for him to win this bind. All he has to do is move his point over my right shoulder, and I'm pretty much out of luck. So, what actions can I do to get out of this situation? Well, the nearest target that I can possibly hit is his lead hand, and that's a good place for me to attack. So what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to bring my right foot across to get myself farther away from the tip of his sword, and then just use the rotation of my hand to cut down onto his arm. Now at this point, because I've just brought my right foot up, I can still go backwards, I can keep stepping this way, or I can bring my left foot up to then close the action. But for now, I've stepped away from him, struck him, and can then leave. What options does he have from that distance? That's a little bit trickier, right? Once we're here and he overpowers me and I use this tempo, he will most likely have to pass all the way back and get around me in order to protect himself, which, yes, he could absolutely do it, but he has to give ground in order to escape, so it's definitely a win for Team Messer. So we'll show that one more time from this side, and then we'll switch sides and show it again. So, we cut at each other, I meet him on the nail, he overpowers me, little cross step, little hit. Now we'll show it from the other way. And this is the way that the actual image shows, so here we go. Just like so. Now let's do that one more time. And really, depending upon when you feel them move in the bind, that's when you should go ahead and do your action. So for example, if Jacob cuts at me and he just kind of stays there, I should just work from here. I mean, I can always grab his blade or push my point in and things along those lines. It's when he adjusts to win that bind that I should use my tempo to move. Another thing to consider is you can use this as a feint quite easily, wherein he starts to cut at me and I'm obliging it to then just kind of touch, if you will. This takes a decent amount of practice, as this cover does have to be real. It's just I'm not putting anything into this bind. And it's usually good if it's someone that is anticipating a bind, which means rather than just cutting at me, what happens is every time he cuts at me, he's ready for me to resist it, so he's actually more cutting over here, which is a very useful thing to watch out in fencers, both yourself and others. But let's go ahead and move on to the second play, shall we? And we'll go back to our original positions again. So, the second sketch is probably the most confusing, as our finishing position will end up looking like this. And this time we are on the correct side. So, our longsword fencer is going to end up right foot forward, basically with his point at the ground like he's an auber, right? Our messer fencer, meanwhile, is going to be to his inside, right? With the arm extended over, and it does look like he's cutting into the arm, though it could also just be hovering very close. We don't know, right? Also right foot forward. Now, this is a tricky one because we have no idea how we got here, right? Let's look at our properties and kind of work backwards. Number one, his blade is low. That means one of two things. Either I avoided this cut entirely, or I slipped from it, or I caused him to chase a feeling. So what I mean by that is sometimes you'll see images where one fencer has his blade like basically points straight at the ground, and the other guy is hitting him in the top of the head, and you're like, how? How did you get here? The way this works is it's when someone is chasing a bind. So for example, come to a bind with me, right? We're here. Now what he currently feels is my pressure against his pressure. That's good. That gives him control, and he can work from there. What you will find sometimes, though, and this goes back into what I talked about before where I feinted by bringing myself up, he's chasing that sensation, and I just leave it, right? I keep him chasing it before snapping around to some other area, right? Now that's just a quick and dirty explanation. But this is why sometimes you'll see someone all the way down at the ground, but they're getting hit in the head. It's simulating that through art, right? At least that's one theory. In practice, you can make someone go pretty far if they're chasing you. But that's one possibility, but to cause that, my blade would need to be here, and it would need to be projecting him downward, which would be fine if I was hitting him on this side, but I'm hitting him on this side. Okay, so maybe I'm having him chase my back edge, but that doesn't make a ton of sense either, because what situation do I end up with my back edge? Well, there was that one play, well, not one play, that one sketch, in which I had met his sword on the outside, so maybe he's trying to reinforce himself against me here, and I am stepping out, but again, that would lead to a cut from above. Maybe I'm keeping him down like so, and then going around, maybe, but I don't think it makes a ton of sense. Not to mention, especially on that side, when he pushes against me, he's far more likely to bring up his back leg to reinforce and put me in a worse position, so that would put us into an entirely different situation. So I don't think it comes out of there, and I don't think that's what it's meant to be symbolizing. Okay, so if that's not the case, maybe I'm voiding his cut entirely, right? We'll step over a little bit so I don't end up in the, there we go. Okay, so maybe, right? Maybe I've moved just in the distance, he cuts, and I'm voiding out of the way, and then cutting from below, right? Maybe I took a low guard to invite a cut into the head. That's possible, right? Not anything out of the ordinary. In regards to me succeeding in voiding like this, it's all about getting him to focus on a narrow target so that when he cuts, I just need to move to its side. You see this when you execute the Krumpau or things along these lines. It's not as difficult as it seems. It looks a little bit wooden when you do it in this situation. But, okay, possible. That would certainly lead to him perhaps doing a full cut that would lead him all the way down to the ground. But why would I cut down into his arms? Okay, maybe I'm expulsing his blade at the same time. Let's use the Krumpau, for example. So in a normal Krumpf play, what I would be doing here is as he cuts at me, I spring out to the side and cut onto his arms, right? Could this be showcasing that, just the blade is drawn a little bit more profiled? Maybe. Or maybe, since I want to make sure that I am protecting myself since I have the inferior weapon in regards to leverage, maybe I'm delivering a strike onto his blade. Okay, so that would look like this. Okay, now I've suppressed him. There's a nice easy cut for me to launch. Okay, that could be it. And certainly I like this action quite a bit, as it's very familiar if you've done the KDF, and then just delivering the quickest, most immediate cut isn't a bad idea. as while yes, I could certainly snap around like I normally would, he has a lot more leverage and can do a lot more mean things to me there. Now, that's subjective, we don't know, but that's what I'm personally feeling. But another option could be, rather than using the edge with a crumph-like motion, I'm using my spine to do the same thing. I often refer to this as a false crumph, where it looks a lot like doing a crumph out, but what I'm doing instead, rather than putting my thumb on the blade like that, I'm actually just turning my arms over and using the back edge. It still works exactly the same. So I'm here, he cuts at me, I'm using the spine to suppress, which also would deny him the ability to feel, because the spine will slide, as will the flat, as we talked about before, and then I'm just hopping over his crossguard for that cut, or maybe the image is showing me coming up toward his face from this position, which makes a lot of sense. You do see this action sword and buckler. I like that a lot, but can we use it any other time if we didn't want to do this dodge? Yes, we can also do this from a bind. So let's say we ended up out here, okay? So I don't have my nail employed. I've got my edge on edge. This is a pretty bad situation for me as he has a lot more leverage than I do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my sword over his and use my spine and a little offline movement to just get his point out of the way. Now this is a little bit over-exaggerated, but from here, as soon as I have that opening, that's when I'm going to launch my attack. So here's what it looks like a little more realistically. So we come in, just a quick little expulsion, then straight into his face, and with a little bit of offline movement, I'm pretty safe. Now, I will say, the sketch really makes it look like he's doing a lot more of a sheer unter, and given Albrecht's, at least presumably Albrecht's drawing skills, we can kind of infer that he means it to be a little bit more dramatic. So maybe he is showing drama, maybe he's showing a little bit more power in the expulsion, I don't know. But I would definitely say this is a cut coming from below, decidedly. Those are just some of my thoughts as to how we get to this position. And another thing that me and a buddy of mine were talking about when we were discussing this is, for all we know, there is no play to get to this situation. It was just some guy that Albrecht was watching fence did a really cool thing, and we cannot possibly replicate it. So let's show that from the other side a couple times, and then we will move on. So, we'll go ahead and go off of the expulsion idea. So I'm going to step out to the side, use the spine, then cut, and then we'll do it from the bind. So we're here, down, cut, do that again, down, cut, and now we'll do it from the bind, here, suppress, cut, here again, suppress, cut. And I can take the arm or the head, it's just the head's a little more natural for me. Okay, so this final one, let's go ahead and switch sides again. This final one is probably the one that I'm closest to 100% certain about. And that's because it's very simplistic, right? So this one is a guy using the finishing position. He will end up right foot forward, right? With his arms extended about chest level. So we're doing a lower thrust than we would normally do, right? Meanwhile, our Messer fencer is going to be right foot forward with his blade hanging down. Now, the image actually makes it look like it's kind of stuck behind him almost. I think this is just because of how the clip point ended up drawn in relation to his leg. But he's essentially doing a hanging parry. And that's exactly what I believe this is. This is just him transitioning to deal with a thrust, and then he can do whatever he feels like. Now, to get to this situation, again, relatively simple. This is one of those universal sword things, right? Pretty much every culture that uses the sword ends up using a hanging parry to defend against a thrust at one point or another, regardless of what weapon, actually. So, maybe he's standing in a flug-like position and he's coming forward and he just happens to be thrusting kind of low, so that way I don't end up binding up here, right? As for what situation could provoke him to do this, I don't know. Maybe he doesn't like stabbing people in the face, as when you don't have a mask on and are actually going to do harm to your fellow human, it's not very fun to stab people in the face, so maybe he's stabbing you in the gut for that reason. Maybe people are sparring safely, but we don't have equipment, so he's choosing to thrust to a lower opening. We don't know, that's all subjective. But we're going to go ahead and say he's coming forward with this thrust to hit me here, and I am in some form of open position. Most likely I'm fighting from one of these, right? I could even be left foot forward. Totally possible. So to deal with this, as this thrust comes in, I'm going to invert my hand, step away from the blade, and I'll actually end up parrying with the flat. This is very, very simple for me to do. I've protected myself quite adequately, and it negates his power, right? Normally, the danger you've got to watch out for when it comes to someone doing this, especially from the crossed arm side, is that he has a ton of leverage. Go ahead and just move my sword aside. He has a ton of leverage in that plane because he's uncrossing his arms, and, you know, 1-on-2, he's definitely got this. Heck, even if he's going from his other side, where he's right foot forward and is just projecting a thrust out at me, right? That's his whole, go ahead, do it. That's his whole body behind it, right? And he can choose to cross it, in which case he gets a ton of pressure, or he can choose to just do an extended thrust, which is still something that I am going to lose out power-wise. So, me using a hanging parry, where I use the closest to my hand that I can and step away, is giving me a good chance of survival. So, we'll go ahead and say he's in a flug-like position, pretty common position. He goes to thrust at me, I step out, and that's where our play ends. What are some things I can do from here? Well, certainly I can grab hold of his crossguard, or his hands, or the strong of his sword. I could also just turn this into a snap. I could, for example, grab and then pull him into it. I have a lot of great options from here. I could even turn this into a wrap or other things along those lines. I have seen grappling actions from here if you really wanted to use them. It's really one of those situations where once you succeed in this parry, do as you know, right? For all we know, he put a ton of gas into that and ends up almost kind of past me with his thrust. That could totally happen, in which case the easiest and simplest option for me to do would be to just parry, take that quick hit, maybe knock his hands out of the way to keep myself super safe, or maybe he's more cagey. Maybe he does a thrust with the intent to kind of come back, right? In which case, okay, I better use a blade action with some more reach instead of trying to bring my arm up, because he'll retract it back out of the way. But either way, this hanging parry at least, very simplistic, and I'm pretty confident that's exactly what we're looking at. So let's go ahead and show it from the other side. So, I can be left foot forward, I can be right foot forward. Doesn't particularly matter. He comes in with that thrust against me, set it aside, do as I know well from there. One more time. And no difficulty. So, thank you very much, Chicken. And that's going to be our conclusion on the Wallerstein Sword versus Messer series. I would love to do some more. We, for example, could cover the Messer versus Dagger, which would be an even more difficult interpretation, but I'd love to tackle it. There's also, of course, the Messer section itself, and a couple other bits in there that would be fun to tackle over time. But either way, that's going to be our conclusion on Wallerstein for now. Thank you all very much for watching, and we will go over some other techniques another time.